It's been a week since a ceasefire came into effect in the most recent escalation in the Israel-Palestine conflict. 11 days of Israeli bombardment that began on May the 10th killed at least 254 Palestinians, including 66 children, and wounded more than 1,900 others in the coastal enclave, according to health authorities. Now, at least 12 people in Israel, including 2 children, were killed by rockets fired by Hamas and other armed groups from Gaza during the same period. This past week, foreign ministers from the US, the UK and Germany have been in the region to try and shore up the ceasefire. I caught up with ambassadors from Israel's neighbours to South Africa, Jordan, Egypt and Palestine, and we spoke about the situation in the region. Ambassadors, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program to all of you. And perhaps to start off this conversation, I'd like to start with you, Ambassador Jarrah, and just maybe ask you, the truce has happened. Do you think that the ceasefire will hold?
Thank you, Peter, for hosting us along with our Arab ambassadors from Jordan and from Egypt. We do believe that it should last the truce because the destruction has been done was widely spread, and the situation in Gaza is devastating. And we do believe that there are the interference of the international community. There is a vibrant atmosphere in Palestine now. Everyone is visiting. Yesterday it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of UK. Mr. Blinken was visiting, also the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Jordan as well, and everyone is involved now in trying to keep the truce in force. It's of the interest of everyone to keep it, and not to keep the truce only, but also to take an advanced steps to make it as long as possible, and not only that, but also to try to find a solution for the whole issue. This is what I heard from Palestine nowadays.
Ambassador El-Fadli, Egypt seemed to play a big role in securing this truce. What do you put that down to? Do you have good relations with Hamas and Israel that you were able to intervene?
Yes, first of all, Konjani, Peter, and thank you for hosting us. The issue, Egypt was immediately seized with the matter for a basic reason. We need to understand why. First, it's not only an immediate neighboring country to Palestine, but also even a lot of the NGOs that come and conduct surveys. Lately, they asked the Egyptians what is the most prominent domestic issue, not international or foreign issue. What is the most domestic issue that Egyptians would be seized with? And you find that the vast majority would answer the Palestinian issue. So this indicates how important the subject matter is to us. Egypt, when we went ahead, our role started even right before in early May, before the violence has started, and we were trying to stabilize the situation once the clashes erupted between the Palestinian protesters and the Israeli police in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. But as you've all followed, we have managed to broker this truce, given our relations with all the concerned parties, be it the Israeli government, the Palestinian Authority, or Hamas. But the more importantly, when Ambassador Jarrah has mentioned about the importance now of stabilizing the ceasefire, and we've been acting on multiple fronts. Immediately, of course, we were trying to reach the ceasefire through various security arrangements between the concerned parties, and then there was also a humanitarian element where we've dispatched also a number of ambulances to treat, and we've treated a lot of Palestinians in our hospitals in Egypt. But then, in order to stabilize the ceasefire, you need to complement this with some political action on the ground as well. And here is where the issue of bringing the parties to the negotiating table and trying to revive the peace talks comes into action, not only through our relations with the immediate parties, the Palestinians and Israelis, but also with other concerned parties. We've witnessed trilateral summit in Paris between the President of France, President SABC, and the King of Jordan. And we've also witnessed multilateral meetings as well, whether in the UN Security Council or the Arab League. And we've been receiving Secretary of State Blinken yesterday, and our Foreign Minister has been going to Ramallah to meet the President Abbas. So there's a lot of action going on the ground. And in tandem with this, we're talking about launching a reconstruction efforts, and there was a pledge of $500 million by Egypt in this regard. What the message is here is that we cannot just sit back and simply condemn or denounce. We need to take action on the ground, and this is what we've been doing on those multiple fronts.
All right, we'll talk a little bit more about some of those initiatives and also the way forward. But if I could turn to you, Ambassador Al-Walda, and just ask perhaps what role can Jordan play in maintaining this current peace? And I say that in inverted commas because I think what we witnessed recently more was an escalation rather than a peace, a genuine peace that had been prevailing before. And especially given the position that Jordan holds, especially when it comes to the West Bank and the history there, what can Jordan do to help the Palestinians and the Israelis to, A, keep the truce, keep peace, and get back onto the negotiating table?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Ndoro, for having me and my two good colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with you in this program and to talk about the situation in Palestine. The situation has been very difficult for a very long time. And Gaza recently was the victim of an attack, a blatant aggression actually by Israel against the civilians of Gaza. And Jordan is very concerned about the situation. You know, we are a next door neighbor and we have a special relationship with the Palestinian people. Besides the special relationship that the king and the Hashemite family in Jordan have with Jerusalem and its religious sites there, both Muslim and Christian, considering that His Majesty is the custodian of those places. Also, the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel of 1994 provides for respecting that custodianship by the King of Jordan over those places. Israel's actions and practices in Jerusalem in particular and all over Palestine are illegal. Evicting the people of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem is a war crime actually. And we have been trying our best as Jordan, being responsible for the Al-Aqsa Mosque or the Haram Sharif site through the Waqf department, which is part of the Jordanian Ministry of Religious Affairs and Waqf. We have been trying to stop those practices by Israel in Jerusalem, in Al-Aqsa, in Sheikh Jarrah also. And our intervention in a positive way in trying to bring an end to this conflict, long conflict in fact, have never stopped and they will not stop. Considering the special relationship that we have with the Palestinians and also the fact that we have a peace treaty with Israel, we are well positioned to play a role in trying to bring the two sides together. Reaching a truce or a ceasefire after this latest attack was a very important step and In this regard, I would second what His Excellency Ambassador Al-Fadli of Egypt has just said about the role that Egypt played together in coordination with Jordan and other Arab countries and with the United States, of course. Egypt also is in a similar situation to try to broker peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians by virtue of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel and the good and excellent relations that Egypt has with the Palestinians. So together we are working. King Abdullah is in close contact with His Excellency the President of Egypt. These two Arab countries, both neighboring Palestine, one to the east, one to the west, are in a position to play an important role. We have been playing that role. We will continue to play that role. We are happy with the truce, but of course, this is not the end of the story. The situation has to be settled peacefully. A political horizon has to be opened, and the fruit of the peace process that started 30 years ago must be reaped sometime soon. I mean by the fruit of the peace process is a peaceful settlement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That includes the establishment of a Palestinian state, independent and sovereign, with Jerusalem as its capital. So I can assure you that we will continue to play our role in this regard.
All right. Again, some of the things that you've mentioned, we'll discuss a bit further. Ambassador Jarrah, I know that time is not on your side, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions before you go. One of them is Antony Blinken has visited Ramallah, Cairo, and Jordan. And my question is, shouldn't Hamas be part of these conversations? It is, after all, Hamas rockets that were firing into Israel.
Well, of course, Hamas is part of the Palestinian fabric and part of the Palestinian political fabric, an important part. And it is communicated, I do believe that the Palestinian leadership is communicating to Hamas the details that has been talked. There has been no agreement, but there has been some announcements by Mr. Blinken and by the Blinken and by the U.S. administration regarding some positive steps towards the relationship with the Palestinians. This included some announcement that the U.S. will reopen a general consulate for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and giving an aid in the amount of some 370 million, some for UNRWA, some for other projects. And I'm sure that the political dialogue that took place, or a kind of arrangements that are taking place now or will take place, are communicated very well through the proper channels between the Palestinian leadership, including Hamas. That's why we witnessed yesterday one of the leaderships of Hamas in Gaza, Sinwar. He was announcing a group of steps or procedures that will be taking place in the near future, including talks between Fatah and Hamas on the way ahead. Unity, a government of unity, Hamas entering the Palestinian Liberation Organization, talks including about the reformation of the Palestine Liberation Organization under the auspices of some Arabic countries, some of the neighboring Arabic countries. So obviously there is no direct communication, but the communication is there through the Palestinian leadership, which Hamas is considered part of it in Gaza.
So the difficulty, I guess, when it comes to trying to find a way forward, and this is for you again, Ambassador Jarrah, is that Israel doesn't want to talk to Hamas. America regards Hamas as a terrorist organization, and yet their influence and the role that they play is quite significant in Palestinian life. How will you navigate a way forward if some of the major players don't want Hamas to be part of the equation?
It's not to Israel only, whether if it wants to talk or not. Israel is part of the formula, and when the international community finds a way to and finds an agenda for a solution that should be put on the table, then Israel should come and sit with the Palestinian side, whether it is Fatah or Hamas. It's the Palestinian leadership decide and who Israel is talking to, and it's not about Israel. I mean, it was the United States who called Netanyahu and ordered him to start a ceasefire, while Netanyahu was refusing to start the ceasefire on that exact day. So it's not only about Israel's decision or about Israel's wish to talk or not to talk. When there is a political will by the international community, things will go on.
Let me start with you, Ambassador Al-Fadli. Your thoughts in terms of the diplomatic relations that you have with Israel and whether they should be downscaled at all?
Well, there has been a lot of talk regarding the status of diplomatic relations with Israel, particularly in our neighborhood. But let me draw your attention to something important, just to illustrate how this operates. First, of course, it's up to each and every country to explain its own position. But regarding Egypt, we have had diplomatic relationships with Israel since we've reached a peace treaty with them back in 1981. But if you look at those 40 years now, you will find that at many times the Egyptian ambassador has been recalled. For example, but he has been recalled primarily, if not almost solely, for issues not related to regular bilateral relations, but more related to regional issues. So we do all remember that in the 1980s, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, for example, in 1982, the ambassador of Egypt was recalled, and for a number of years. He was also recalled later in 2000 during the second Intifada. He was also recalled after that in November 2012, after the assassination of Hamas leaders. So what I'm trying to say is, normalization of relations with Israel doesn't mean that it's going to be a honeymoon in perpetuity. There are going to be ups and downs, and we need to accept this as a part and parcel of what we define as normalization of relations. Normalization should not and will not be perceived as a honeymoon in perpetuity. And these incidents that I referred to are testimony to that. Now, when it comes to this specific incident now, the crisis that we have been facing now, had we not had diplomatic relations with all the concerned parties, not just with the Israeli government, we would not have been able to broker that ceasefire. So again, determining the utility of diplomatic relations, what you can do with it is up to each and every state, and it's a sovereign decision in this regard. What matters in the end is deeds, not words. So can you really deliver? Can you really make use of those relationships to serve the purpose that we are considering right now? Thank you.
Ambassador Al-Walda, we saw many Jordanians on the streets protesting against Israel, and some even trying to cross the border to support their Palestinian brothers. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has had a difficult time in terms of respecting some of the peace treaty provisions. And as you described, particularly when it comes to the holy sites in Jerusalem, where does that leave Jordan and Israel in terms of diplomatic relations? And again, the question to you is, can there be or should there be questions about downsizing or reducing diplomatic engagement?
Well, you're right to notice that movement on the Jordanian street by Jordanians in protest, strong protest against the aggression by Israel on the Palestinian people. And there have been also calls by people in the street to sever relations or to close the embassy or to send back the Israeli ambassador from Amman to Israel or recall the Jordanian ambassador. That only shows how strong people feel about what is going on in Palestine, especially the recent attack. People don't seem to feel the real nature of peace and the relationship between Jordan and Israel, that they don't see a reflection of the peace process which started 30 years ago on the Palestinians. Their lot has not improved, their situation has only deteriorated. The Israeli practices, especially in Jerusalem, have been going on negatively affecting the peace atmosphere in the region, in particular between the countries, the Arab countries that have established peace with Israel. So you're right, Netanyahu has not been respecting provisions of the peace agreements, especially when it comes to the land, the confiscation of Palestinian land in the West Bank, the establishment of more and more settlements, illegal settlements, evicting people from their homes, Palestinians. The most recent example was the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. All of these practices are illegal under international law, evicting people under occupation who are supposed to be protected people under international law by virtue of the fact that Israel is an occupying power. That's a war crime, and we have been calling on the international community, especially the political machinery of the world, which is the United Nations and the Security Council, to put pressure on Israel to make it stop such practices and show us the real desire, if they have that, for a peace. And a peace in the region, we have made this very clear, a real peace in the region, a comprehensive and lasting peace in the region cannot be achieved without the fulfillment of the rights of the Palestinians, the national rights, not only human rights, not, within the framework of human rights, not these human rights, but the national rights to have an independent, sovereign Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. We have been working on this all along, and we have been utilizing our relation with Israel. And this is in relation to your previous question, to which my dear brother, Ambassador Al-Fadli, answered. I would second what he said, that we hope that the fact that there is a peace agreement or a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel would be an effective and useful tool to help bring real peace in the region. And that can be done only when the Palestinians have their own state. Well, in the framework of this relationship that we have with Israel, I may add a small point here, also similar to what Ambassador Ahmed Al-Fadli said, is that by virtue of this peace agreement with Israel, we are able to support the Palestinians better than if there was no peace treaty, because we do have contacts with Israel. Only today, the latest caravan of humanitarian assistance went from Jordan to Gaza. That needs some coordination with the Israeli authorities. And but we are waiting for real positive steps from the Israeli government, and we hope that the international community, with the intervention of major countries in the world, including, by the way, South Africa, which is a peace-loving country, which has had its own experience with colonial rule and apartheid, we hope that South Africa can also play an important role in this.
Ambassador, I'm going to interrupt you because Ambassador Jarrah needs to go, but I just have one final question for her before she leaves us. And so we've seen Qatar funding Hamas, helping Hamas, I believe with the help of even Israel in this equation. And this keeps on talking to this idea that there are two Palestines, one Palestine that's controlled by Hamas and the other Palestine that's controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Has Qatar assisted the Palestinian Authority, or do they speak directly to Hamas? Because we just need to be clear that there is a united Palestine, not factions that are at war with each other.
Yes, Qatar and Palestine enjoys a good bilateral relationship. Actually, excellent relationships. So I assure you that no money goes only to Hamas. Money goes to Gaza for reconstruction, for supporting Palestinian resilience, for supporting the steadfastness of Palestinians, and in full coordination and cooperation with the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian leadership. And we have millions of examples of bilateral official visits conducted by President Mahmoud Abbas to Qatar and vice versa. So no worries, Qatar is not directing the money to Hamas. And after all, we can say that Hamas is an integral part of the Palestinian society. Hamas is an integral part of the social fabric of the Palestinians. And Gaza and West Bank, East Jerusalem are all one territory. It's only Israel that's trying to show that they are two different territories by the geographical disconnectivity and by the borders, the fake borders that they are trying to make for the sake of disseminating the fact that there is no united Palestine, or the Palestinians are not united. The fact is that any Arab country that supports Gaza, because Gaza is in their need for support. Now, after the airstrike, after the mass destruction that took place, after the mass numbers of casualties in Gaza, they need support. And every single penny directed from Qatar or from any other country around the world, it will be through the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian Authority. And this was announced yesterday by Prime Minister, and it was clear that all the funds that are directed for the efforts of reconstruction in Gaza shall be directed and in full coordination and collaboration with the Palestinian Authority.
All right, Ambassador Jarrah, I know that you have another pressing engagement that you need to go to, so I want to thank you so much indeed for joining us, and we'll chat again in the near future, I'm sure. But we'll carry on with the conversation with your other colleagues.
Thank you, and thank you, my colleagues. See you, bye-bye. Bye.
Gentlemen, if we can carry on with this conversation, and I guess the question is, so the immediate conflict escalation is over, but what happens next? Let me start with you, Ambassador Al-Walda.
Well, as you know, we, as Jordan, have always been hopeful of achieving a peaceful settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian question. And we have never ceased our efforts. We always work in tandem with our friends and brothers like Egypt and other Arab countries, with the international community. And we hope that now that the United States has a new administration which seems to be giving some signals of its seriousness to make an effort to try to reach a settlement. We hope that there will be some peaceful settlement in the near future, but we only need to keep on going, to keep on pressing and trying with our brothers and friends, because there is, as you know, the parameters for a peace process are there. Almost everybody knows how a peaceful settlement is going to look like. You know, there was the peace process that started in Madrid some 30 years ago. There were the agreements between the Palestinians and the Israelis, starting with the Oslo Accords in September '93. And there is also the Arab Peace Plan. There are Security Council resolutions. There are agreements that were reached during this long process of negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis. There is a lot of ground there for a real peace to be arrived at. There is real ground there. What is lacking, in fact, is the political will on the Israeli side to really reach that end and commit to what I referred to earlier as the fruit of the peace process, which is freedom for the Palestinians, the independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem, East Jerusalem as its capital. If that does not happen, we're not going to go anywhere. Then we will stay in this vicious cycle where every few years you have such an aggression by Israel against Gaza and a few hundred people killed and a few thousand people injured and maimed and a lot of property destroyed. So at the present moment, what we need is real pressure on Israel to stop its provocative and illegal acts against the Palestinians, in particular in Jerusalem, and to enable the Palestinians to have their own state on part of historic Palestine, to which they have agreed in principle in the Oslo Accord. So we need to work on that. We, together with the international community and with, as I said, the major powers of the world need to play an important part here to make Israel realize that what it is doing is not helping peace. It's not getting us anywhere. And if in the absence of peace, not only the Palestinians are harmed, but also the Israelis. So our question is, do they really want peace or not? If they do, then the way to that is very clear. The parameters are there. We need only to show the goodwill. The Palestinians have committed to that. The Arab countries around Palestine have committed to that. In fact, all the Arab countries have adopted the Arab Peace Plan many years ago, and it is still on the table, together with the other references of international legitimacy. That's the Security Council resolutions, the agreements that were reached between the Palestinians and the Israelis. All of that is a whole package that, if dealt with in good will, should get us to a peace. And we will never give up on that. We will always work for peace.
Ambassador, you mentioned the role that superpowers can play. And I'm going to ask you, Ambassador Al-Fadli, the United States, I think, seems to be a key player in this equation, especially when one considers how the Security Council struggled to come out with a statement on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict recently. And that was because America was the country that was stopping some kind of communication coming through. Your relationship with America hasn't always been easy. And I'm surprised that the first phone call from President Joe Biden only happened recently. And I guess that was in large part because he needed your help to get a ceasefire secured.
Well, clearly the resolution of this ongoing crisis is not going to be solved overnight, and it's not going to be solved by just one party alone. You need the collaboration of the international community at large. But before that, there have been multiple efforts to do the following, and we need to take in consideration the following as well. First, there were efforts to reconcile the various factions in Palestine between Hamas and the Palestinian and Fatah and Palestinian Authority and so forth. Because, as you said earlier, you need Palestinians to be united and talking with one voice. So this was one effort, I think, that everybody recognized Egypt's role in this regard. There have been numerous and extensive efforts exerted in this regard. The second is that there were two elements, I think, novel elements that have been introduced in this particular crisis compared to previous cyclical violence that we have witnessed in the area. The first is that the Hamas, the military capabilities of Hamas have developed considerably. So this is a challenge to the regular security doctrine adopted by Israel. So although, of course, there's always this issue of Israeli response has always been beyond what should have been exercised in these respects, given the difference in capacities and capabilities between both parties. But the message is clear. So the Iron Dome is not alone going to savior, Israel, and allow it to continue its occupation in perpetuity. The second is the element of the Arab Israelis now. We are talking now about Israeli citizens, they're Palestinians who have chosen or have remained in what we know today as Israel, and they have been also discontented with Israeli practices that, in the eyes of many, and even President Ramaphosa, has characterized them as amounting to apartheid. So these are two important factors that have been introduced into the equation right now to induce the international community to act accordingly. We all recall that during the election campaign in the US, the general sentiment was that at the time that perhaps the peace process and what's going on there is not going to be a top priority for the US administration. But then I think the actions that we have seen, the recent crisis that we have witnessed right now, has been pushing this further up the priority list of the US administration. And this is where we get all those contacts and all these actions now. And I think there's a need for a concerted effort by everybody to take into consideration these new dynamics. So in the end, we cannot continue to act as if nothing happened. No, we do have developing military capabilities by Hamas. Yes, they induce a heavier retaliation by the Israelis. And of course, you get into this other cycle whereby, of course, this induces widespread condemnation by NGOs and humanitarian and human rights groups and all over the world, not just in our region, but and perhaps here this was some fresh air coming into the process, and perhaps we seize this opportunity to salute our South African brothers and President Ramaphosa and Dr. Pandor, party leaders and other South African brothers and sisters who showed their strong support and solidarity with the Palestinians. When you talk about the peace relations, even with countries like Egypt and Jordan and others, we do have a public opinion, strong public opinion in the streets. And even if we have a peace treaty, and even if we have government-to-government relations, in the end, you can't take a horse to the river and force it to drink. And this is why a lot of people have labeled the peace between Egypt and Israel as a cold peace, because the population, the Egyptian peoples themselves, were not comfortable with having warm relations with their Israeli counterparts. Why? Because of what they see, not only vis-a-vis in the occupied Palestinian territories, but even vis-a-vis the Arab Israelis. So, in the end, these actions, if they continue like that, I don't think that they would help, but they would make things difficult. Even some people in Israel, some people in Israel have even in their analysis of the situation and what happened from the Arab Israelis, they were alarmed that this may lead to some form of a civil war down the road. So, I mean, these dynamics should induce everybody, all concerned parties, to revamp the peace process in order to reach a stable and just solution that guarantees the rights of the Palestinian people in accordance with international references. Other than that, then I think we are doomed for, a difficult situation that may get out of hand later on in any of those other similar crises that may erupt down the road. Thank you.
Ambassador Al-Fadli, I'm going to ask you one more question. We're starting to wrap our conversation up, but both of you have mentioned how Israel is being described by many people now as an apartheid state. And part of that is to do with the freedom of movement that the Palestinians can enjoy and that they don't enjoy at the moment. There's this blockade, particularly around Gaza. And Ambassador Al-Fadli, the Egyptian border is closed, and many say that that contributes to that blockade. Why is the Egyptian-Gaza border closed?
First of all, the Egyptian border back a few months ago was opened. And when the clashes erupted, it was opened a day even before when it was supposed to be for humanitarian needs and so forth. And the opening and closing of the border primarily relate to two important factors. First is the humanitarian element, and the other is the security element. As you know, we have been and still are fighting terrorism, particularly in the furthermost northeastern part of the Sinai, adjacent to the Gaza, the borders with Gaza. So there needs to be some form of a strict limitation of movement until we are done with this war on terror in order to protect civilians as well. But then this did not hinder us from opening it up to our Palestinian brothers for humanitarian purposes. Humanitarian here does not simply mean just food and medical supply, but the movement of people through that border, but it is done in an organized manner and in coordination with the competent authorities on the ground.
All right, and perhaps finally for you, Ambassador Al-Walda, you've spoken about Jerusalem quite a bit and the role that the King of Jordan plays in relation to the holy sites there. In a future Palestine, Jerusalem is a key element. How do you think that this issue can be dealt with? We saw Donald Trump declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel, and these evictions, some people say, are pointing to Israel trying to make the whole of Jerusalem a Jewish city.
Well, yes, of course, the Israelis' practices in Jerusalem do not make us very optimistic, but we have rejected those practices all along. They are illegal. East Jerusalem is part of the occupied territories that were occupied in the 1967 war, and any peace settlement must have the withdrawal, must provide for the withdrawal of Israel from East Jerusalem. Jordan, as you mentioned, has the custodianship, or the Hashemite family, indeed, the King Abdullah at the moment, has the custodianship over the religious sites in East Jerusalem. And of course, the moment that a true peace settlement is reached and the Palestinian state is established with Jerusalem as its capital, the King and Jordan will happily hand over responsibility for these sites to the Palestinian government of the future Palestinian state, which we hope will not be very far in the future, but in the near future. So that's very clear. But as we are ending now, I may, if you allow me, just point out again that no real peace can be achieved in the region without the establishment of a Palestinian state, independent, sovereign, and contiguous, not very divided into small pieces as the situation on the ground now shows because of the settlements. Once that state is established and the Palestinians enjoy their freedom and their human rights and security within their internationally recognized borders on the basis of the June 5th, or June 4th, in fact, 1967, then we will have peace. Before that, I'm afraid we will, as a region, continue to be in this vicious cycle for some time to come.
Your Excellencies, thank you very, very much indeed for your time and your insights on the challenges facing your region. So to you, Ambassador Ahmed Al-Fadli and Ambassador Ibrahim Al-Walda, thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's an interesting conversation that I had with Arab ambassadors to South Africa that are neighbours to Israel. That's Jordan, Egypt and Palestine. And in case you're interested, we're going to be on Media Monitor this weekend taking a look at how the media was reporting the conflict inside Israel. So that's all happening at the weekend.